So you want to build a Ryzen 5600 gaming PC build in 2022, and you're looking to know the best motherboard, memory, and coolers for your gaming build. Don't worry, you've come to the right place. Hi, welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. The Ryzen 5600 is here, finally! And it's actually a great time to build a gaming PC with GPU prices going down to MSRP and maybe even below. We're gonna go through the best Ryzen 5600 gaming PC build, and we'll take a look at the price to performance comparison of the Ryzen 5600 versus Intel i5-12400 gaming PC builds. If you get value out of the video, please give it a like. It makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. With that, let's jump into it. The Ryzen 5600 is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU based on AMD's Zen 3 architecture. Like the 5600X, it comes with 32 megabytes of L3 cache and a TDP of 65 watts. Now there's really only two differences between the Ryzen 5600 and 5600X. The first is that the 5600 is clocked 200 megahertz lower than the 5600X for both base and boost frequencies. So instead of the Ryzen 5600X's base 3.7 gigahertz and boost frequency of 4.6 gigahertz, the Ryzen 5600 offers 3.5 gigahertz and 4.4 gigahertz boost. Given the CPU is overclockable, not that big a difference. The other difference is the slightly lower thermal throttle limit of 90 degrees Celsius, down from 95 degrees Celsius on the Ryzen 5600X. But what about performance? Looking at Tom's Hardware Day 1 review, there isn't a lot of difference between the Ryzen 5600X and the Ryzen 5600. We'll link the review down in the video description below for a deeper dive, but the TLDR is exactly what we expected. Using an RTX 3090 for 1080p gaming, the Ryzen 5600X was less than 4% faster than the Ryzen 5600, and at 1440p gaming, that margin shrunk to just 1%. This is also what we've seen in previous Ryzen generations with the Ryzen 3600 versus the 3600X versus the Ryzen 3600 XT. So should you get the Ryzen 5600 or the 5600X? Well, at the current price difference right now, it's about $30, and given the performance difference, it's virtually non-existent unless you're using the highest end GPU right now. The Ryzen 5600X no longer seems worth it, and I would just look to upgrade the GPU, the RAM, cooling, storage, or motherboard instead. Now, if that price difference becomes more negligible, then of course it might make sense, as it's hard to upgrade anything for a small amount of money. So how does the Ryzen 5600 stack up against Intel's i5-12400? Well, as expected, compared to the i5-12400, the Ryzen 5600 with Precision Boost Overdrive enabled matched gaming performance for the newer Intel part, while the i5-12400 won more often than it lost in productivity benchmarks. Of course, if you are more productivity focused, then I would recommend neither of these CPUs and instead moving up to a Ryzen 5700X or an i5-12600K instead. Of course, very few people are going to pair an RTX 3090 with either a Ryzen 5600, a Ryzen 5600X, or an i5-12400. So the reality is that for any GPU below that performance level, we should see virtually identical gaming performance out of any of these CPUs. Let's take a brief look at the competition from the i5-12400 versus the Ryzen 5600 in terms of price to performance. Now let's start off with the Intel i5-12400. If you want to build a budget gaming Intel system, all the memory is going to be the same, the video card is going to be the same, everything is going to be the same, except for the motherboard and the CPU, obviously. So let's just take a look at those platform costs. Right now, you can get an i5-12400 for $180. Very, very good advantage for Intel. However, the big failing of 12th gen Intel is the B660 motherboard platform. If you want a motherboard that will actually run the CPU at the full frequency and get the full experience of it, you've got to jump all the way up to the MSI Pro B660M for $140. That gives it a total package price of $320. Again, because some of the cheaper B660 motherboards simply either through poor VRMs or through poor boosting behavior will not give you the most out of that CPU. If we compare that against the Ryzen 5600, note I've got the 5600X in here because PC Part Picker hasn't put the 5600 in, but for $200 we can get that CPU, and there are an abundance of B550 motherboards that will run the CPU at full tilt like the Gigabyte B550M DS3H, for much cheaper. In this case, $109, but this motherboard is often as cheap as $90 or $95. Right now, a total package price of $308, so slight price advantage here to Ryzen for the same gaming experience. But what if we go up to a more premium gaming experience? We want better audio on our motherboard. We want better features on that motherboard. Well, really, the next motherboard up is quite a bit up. It's the MSI Mag B660M Mortar for $175. Now, you do get Wi-Fi on this board. That's very, very nice. However, this is the cheapest ALC 1200 audio codec motherboard out there. So if you do need the audio, this is your next step up in terms of a more premium gaming experience. For $354 all told, it's kind of a steep ask. Versus the Ryzen 5600 offering, you can pick up a motherboard like the Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro-P, similar feature set, does not have the Wi-Fi, for $130 instead. So that's a $30 difference. And for that difference, you could certainly pick up either a Wi-Fi add-in card, or you could simply go with a slightly more expensive motherboard like the Asus TUF Gaming B550M. So overall right now, I would say there is definitely a slight advantage to the Ryzen platform, especially if the 5600 declines in price over time. And I think in order to be competitive, Intel needs to fix their B660 motherboard lineup or reduce pricing of the good motherboards that are out there, and probably have further cuts to the 12400F and 12400. So what's the best GPU for a Ryzen 5600? The good news is that as I'm filming this, GPU prices continue to fall, with several near their MSRP. Check the links in the video description for current pricing. Right now, I'd pair the Ryzen 5600 with any GPU up to an RTX 3070 or Radeon 6800, and the Ryzen 5600 would make sense all the way up to an RTX 3080 if you really want to push it, before feeling compelled to go to a higher tier CPU. If building a mid-range system, I think anything from a Radeon RX 6600 or RTX 3060, with a particular focus on the RX 6600 XT, 6700 XT, both of which have dropped significantly in price, or the RTX 3060 Ti or 3070 if you must have an NVIDIA GPU. So what's the best memory for Ryzen 5600? Well, for 99% of you, the answer is going to be a 2x8GB kit of DDR4 3200 CL16, especially given the current pricing. Possibly a 3600 CL16 kit if pricing isn't that much higher. I'll leave links to some memory kits in the video description below. The reality is that unless you're using an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3070 GPU or an AMD Radeon 6800 or faster GPU, it's unlikely you're going to see any FPS improvement even at 1080p. Even with the high-end GPUs like the RTX 3080 Ti or 3090, there's only about a 5% improvement at 1080p. At 1440p or higher resolution, even with the fastest available GPU, there's going to be 0 FPS going above 3200 CL16 speed. Separately, the question of whether to chase the less than 5% performance increase at 1080p using dual rank memory, not to be confused with dual channel, seems to be largely moot, given that we're building a mid-range gaming PC and we can find better places to improve performance. But if you do decide to get 32GB of memory and you want to guarantee that you get dual rank, then either getting two identical 2x8GB kits or a 4x8GB kit is the way to do it, seeing as many 16GB sticks are no longer coming dual rank due to the silicon shortage. But again, my strong recommendation is a 2x8GB kit of DDR4 3200 CL16 and spend the money upgrading something else instead. So what's the best motherboard for Ryzen 5600? I'll leave a link to our recent best motherboards for Ryzen 2022 down in the video description. Now, at the time of filming, it does appear that the Ryzen 5600 will require a BIOS that supports at least a GISA 12.0.6b or higher, which just came out in early March 2022. That means most motherboards won't have it, and you'll likely need a motherboard with BIOS flashback to update the BIOS out of the box without a CPU. The best motherboard for Ryzen 5600 is almost certainly a B550 motherboard, which offers PCIe Gen 4 support at the main GPU slot and one of the M.2 slots. We certainly don't need to spend the extra money for X570 to get even more PCIe Gen 4 lanes. That's really for production-oriented users and not gamers. But we also don't want to go with B450 or A520, as they don't support any PCIe Gen 4 at all. So a B550 motherboard with BIOS flashback is what we're focused on. There's a number of ultra budget B550s like the Gigabyte B550M DS3H and the MSI Pro VDH Wi-Fi. But if you want better audio and better features, check out the Aorus B550M Pro-P for about $130, which offers great connectivity and improved ALC 1200 audio codec. The ASUS TUF Gaming B550M is another good option, and it's usually available for around $140 or with Wi-Fi closer to $150. For full-size ATX motherboards, the Aorus Elite B550, the full-size ATX version, avoid the micro ATX version, or the ASUS TUF B550 are great options. And if you want something more premium, consider the Aorus B550 Pro or ASUS ROG Strix B550A or B550F. If you need the front panel USB Type-C connector, the V2 version of the Aorus motherboards have it, as do the B550 Tomahawk and B550 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. Let's talk about the best cooler for Ryzen 5600. The Ryzen 5600 does come with the included Ray Stealth box cooler, and that's absolutely fine to get you going. However, like the 5600X, I recommend upgrading to at least a budget tower air cooler to maximize performance under load, to run cooler overall, and reduce system noise. Now, most 4 heat pipe budget tower air coolers will give you all you need, and I'll include a link to my recent Best Coolers for Ryzen 2022 video down in the description. A couple of suggestions that I really like are the id Cooling SE224XT, which comes in black, white, or metallic, the Gamix 400 lineup, which are very cheap and look nice, or the Vetru V5. If you do want to go with an AIO cooler for additional reduced thermals and noise, as well as for aesthetic reasons, then I'd recommend getting a 240mm AIO like the id Cooling ZoomFlow 240X, the Cooler Master Master Liquid V2, or similar unit. I definitely wouldn't spend any extra money on a 280 or 360mm unit, as that's just total overkill. Just know that if you're getting an AIO instead of an air cooler, you're primarily spending money for less noise and the aesthetics here, like additional RGB. Something I personally feel is worth it, but others might think isn't necessary. But if it isn't necessary, why do we buy cases with glass side panels? Remember, we still need good case airflow, and we're looking for at least 2 intake and 1 exhaust fan in a well-ventilated case. Let's talk about the best SSD for Ryzen 5600. If you haven't had a chance to check out my best SSD for gaming video, I'll leave a link to it down in the video description for a deeper dive. Basically, there is no current gaming benefit from using anything faster than even a SATA SSD. Now that being said, PCIe Gen 3 M.2 NVMe drives are now cheaper than SATA SSDs, and there's no fuss with cable management, so that's what we're going to focus on today. There are a number of great budget M.2 NVMe SSDs like the TeamForce Z330, Western Digital SN550 or SN750, Silicon Power A60, and others. I'll leave links to a couple in the video description, and my advice is just get the cheapest one and avoid high-priced Gen 3 NVMEs like the Samsung 970 EVO, as well as any of the Gen 4 drives unless they are on significant sale or you've maxed out upgrades in other areas. Let's quickly go through 2 suggested build templates that you can use right now. Let's go through an ultra budget one, and then we'll go with one with more premium features. We're gonna start out with an $890 Ryzen 5600 1080p budget beast. I can't believe we're talking about building a 5600 system for less than $1,000 right now. You cannot get a pre-built that will beat this right now, so just know that. Let's go through the build. Obviously, we're going to use the Ryzen 5600, not in PC part picker yet. I've just used the 5600X as a stand-in, and I've set the price to $200, which is about what we should expect to find it for. For the motherboard, I've gone with a Gigabyte B550M DS3H. Remember, we want something with BIOS flashback. This has it. Great budget board. 109 is usually a little higher than it sells for. For the memory, again, don't need anything faster than 3200 CL16 memory. 3600 CL16 is not going to do you any favors at this graphics card level, so don't spend the money here. Spend it on a better graphics card. $54 right now, Silicon Power Kit. I simply went with the cheapest available M.2 NVMe SSD right now. Happens to be the Team Group MP33. But again, I'll look down in the video description, check the prices of the ones that I recommend, and just pick the cheapest one. For the graphics card, the card that I would go with right now is like the Radeon RX 6600. Just happens that this is the cheapest one. Just grab the cheapest one, $375. These are rapidly approaching their MSRP, which is fantastic news. And if you view this in a couple months, maybe this will be a high price and you'll be able to find things for lower. Unfortunately, right now, as I film this, NVIDIA cards, the prices aren't keeping up. They're still way too high in terms of their price to performance. But if you absolutely have to have an NVIDIA card, 3050 sells right now for about $370, $380. Unfortunately, the 3060 sells for more like $520, which is a little bit more expensive. For the cooler, we're just going to go with the Wraith Stealth Cooler. It's not even need to be in here because it comes with the CPU itself. Maybe a little bit noisy, runs a little bit hot, but certainly it'll be fine for this build. If you have a little bit extra money, it is one of the areas I would take a look at upgrading first. For the case, I just went with something ultra cheap here that actually has enough fans. In this case, it's the NMX Marble Shell ARGB case. It's a micro ATX case. Comes, I believe, with 4 included ARGB fans. Looks really nice. Now, I believe these fans are Molex, which means that they will run at 100% speed most of the time. If that bothers you, by all means, get a different case. This one for $60 is a steal right now. And then the power supply. The great thing about the 5600 is it doesn't use a lot of power, and especially if we're using some of the AMD RX 6000 series GPUs, they don't use a lot of power either. So you can get away with frankly, a 450 watt would have been fine, but when you're at this kind of low point in terms of power supplies, you just grab the cheapest available. And in this case, that was the Cooler Master Master Watt 550. Now remember, we want to get a PSU that's at least tier C or better on the PSU Cultist list. As always, check out my PSU buying guide for more info on that, but make sure it's C tier or better. Don't get a pile of junk. You don't want to blow up your system. So for $889, we're going to get a system that absolutely kills it at 1080p gaming, and frankly, easy to run games you could certainly do at 1440p. But let's say you want to step up to more 1440p gaming, you want better audio, you want better cooling on the CPU. What do? Let's go through it. First thing I did is I upgraded the cooler to the id Cooling SE224XT. Note there is an ARGB version of this for like $1 or $2 more if you want to do that. I just went ahead and went with the all black version, but really any of these 3 to 4 heat pipe tower coolers will be absolutely fine for you. You can of course go with an AIO all-in-one liquid cooler here if you want the aesthetics and even more reduction in terms of noise and thermals. For the motherboard, remember Ryzen has an absolute ton of good motherboards. The Gigabyte B550M Aorus Pro-P is one of them. ALC 1200 audio codec on it. Looks a lot nicer too than some of those budget boards. The VRM considerably better on these. It's got heat shields on the M.2s, and it's got a ton more rear panel USB connectivity to it for only $130. For the memory, we're still sticking it out with a cheaper DDR4 3200 CL16 kit. Feel free here if you want to spend a little bit money on an RGB kit or something that looks a little nicer. We're just going to go ahead and stick it out with the cheapest available kit. I just went ahead and grabbed the cheapest 1 terabyte SSD. That's about $75 right now for the Team MP33. For the graphics card, the RTX 3060 Ti is selling for a pretty good price right now over at Newegg in the US. $570, not bad, given that this is a graphics card that just mere months ago was going for over $1,000. Nowhere near its MSRP just yet. I don't know if we'll ever see the MSRP. I think it was about $400 US. Probably see this card eventually come down to about the $500 mark. That's where I would expect it to settle in. So $569 right now, if you want to grab something and do it now, not a terrible price. Alternatively, you could look at, for almost the same price, the RX 5700 XT. That card has more performance than the 3060 Ti. Doesn't have some of the other features that the 3060 Ti does. So it depends on which kind of card you're looking for. If you're looking for raw rasterization performance, that's definitely the 6700 XT. If you're looking for some of the NVENC and other things, 3060 Ti, honestly, can't really go wrong with either one for about $570. For the case, we just stuck it out with the marble shell. Why not? But you certainly could go with a more premium case here. You could look at something like the Fantex P360A. That's a case I often recommend. Corsair 4000D. Although those cases have gone up quite a bit in price given the shipping challenges that continue to happen for large items like cases that you need to ship across the ocean. So I just stuck it out with a Marble Shell MS-20. For the power supply, we just stuck it out with a 550 watt unit. It's simply the cheapest available right now, and it's more power than we need. So for $1,165, we get a 1440p capable gaming PC here, and it's all due to the Ryzen 5600 at $199. Remember, if you got value of the video, give it a like. It makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. If, of course, you want to find the best coolers for Ryzen or the best motherboards, I'm going to give you 2 video links right here. Best motherboards up here, 2022 just updated, and just updated the best cooler video as well. Check them out, and we'll catch you on the next one.